India announced last month at COP26 that it was going to achieve net zero by 2070. And that was a fairly significant announcement. I don't think it was expected. I'm going to talk to Professor Milind Kandlikar from the University of British Columbia about that. What does it mean? And how might India achieve those goals? So welcome to the interview, Milind.
Thank you, Markham.
Look, what's your general take on the announcement?
Well, look, I've been following these announcements for 30 years since the Rio summit, and everybody makes announcements, right? The thing that I found refreshing about this announcement is a bit more realistic than everything that we've seen coming up over the past 2 decades. And we're starting to get a bit more realism now in the ways countries are announcing, but even now, talks about net zero by 2040 or 2050, even for industrialized economies, is hard, right? I mean, that it's a tough problem, and it's easy for politicians to satisfy their local constituencies and make those claims in industrialized countries because there's a demand for that sort of a claim. For India to say 2070 might seem way into the future. That's almost 50 years from now, but there's a sense of, it smacks a bit of realism. Let me put it that way.
Before we get into India specific, I want to ask you a question, and that is we're clearly now into an energy transition. I've argued in columns that we're 20, 30 years into it. We see many of the technologies like batteries, electric vehicles, and so on, kind of hitting the inflection point on the S curve. Does that make India's goals more realistic? I mean, if you have better technology and cheaper technology, doesn't that make the decarbonization of the Indian economy easier and cheaper and more realistic?
Oh, absolutely, it does, right? It does. It is completely. I mean, India is a coal heavy, heavily dependent on coal. I mean, there's coal and there's hydro. There are the two big aspects of Indian energy sector, electricity sector. Don't have much natural gas, don't have much access to natural gas because building pipelines through Pakistan and Afghanistan from the Gulf into India is hard, right? And it's a poor country, so it'll take whatever resources it has to generate electricity. So India is still coal heavy, but the price of solar has plummeted, as you know, really hard. India was one of the early adopters of wind, although things have pulled back a bit. And so, yes, I think as the price of technology keeps falling, which if it happens with batteries and other allied technologies, along with solar panels and so on, it seems like a reasonably realistic goal. Now, the issue, of course, is organizational, right? It's not technology as much as it's the ability of Indian system to incorporate these technologies to be able to, for the utilities which are mostly in the red, especially the transmission and distribution parts, to be able to integrate all of this new technological change in order to deliver, to the needs of 1.45, I don't know what the number will be by 2070, billion people.
That's actually, you raise a very good point, because in economic development circles, the idea of capacity building at the local, the regional, and the subnational government level has been discussed for decades. And what I'm hearing you say is, even if you've got great technology, even if you had maybe the financing to implement that technology, capacity at the local level may not be there to take advantage of it. Have I got that correct?
Well, not necessarily. I'm not saying it's not going to be there, but it's not enough in a country that's as complicated as India to say the prices are low, right? Because what happens, for example, often with electricity is local state governments will declare free power to farmers. Just an example, right? It happens all the time. Now, how do you run a modern grid and keep it in the black and keep investments flowing in and plan for capacity increases and building infrastructure, et cetera, when you have, this sort of thing happening quite routinely, right? And so essentially there's a sort of organizational and, economic restructuring. The political system has to get out of the grid, right? I mean, in industrialized countries, obviously, there are regulatory bodies that create that buffer zone, even though electricity is a monopoly, right? It's a controlled monopoly with regulatory bodies that make these calls. In India, things aren't as clean.
Is there an opportunity here, Milind, for the countries like Canada, perhaps, to provide assistance in the formulation of policy and regulation, institutional building, that sort of thing?
This is the Indian paradox. I mean, the capacity, the individual capacity, the people with the smarts, the know-how, the know what to do is there, right? So how do you take this sort of democratic system and transition it to this, right? And so what's needed are models within India that can be created and replicated. And some of this is already emerging. I mean, there's a lot of investment going into, say, solar power, right? And so people are starting to see how sort of systems that do some pricing in some kind of rational way, helps. And I think the hope is that that learning then diffuses into the broader power sector. And that's just one sector we're talking about, because there's transport, there's home heating and cooking, there's a whole bunch of problems that India has to deal with.
Let's talk about transportation. What are the issues around decarbonizing India's transportation system?
Well, I mean, India's transportation system is automobiles are on the rise, right? Although there are a lot of different modes. There are in the cities, you have these things called auto rickshaws. I'm talking about the public transit. Of course, there are buses that run primarily on diesel. There is a proliferation of two-wheelers of all sorts, right? And in the lower ends of the sort of spectrum, meaning bikes and e-bikes and scooters, I think the decarbonization, or at least the electrification, which are two distinct things, as you know, depends on where the electricity is coming from, will probably happen quite fast, right? Because the issues around charging infrastructure and impact on the grid, etc., are probably less dramatic than they are for automobiles, for cars, for passenger vehicles. And but for passenger vehicles, it's clear that the price of batteries has to fall, right? And the Indian consumer is far, far more price sensitive because it's not a wealthy country. I mean, there are, of course, some very rich people in India. There's probably a Germany sitting inside India, so to speak, as in terms of sort of the group of people who can afford some of these things. But in general, it's a poor country. So the price of batteries has to fall, and it has to plummet before there is uptake of batteries. Now, the price of oil in India is high. India doesn't produce any of its oil. There are no government subsidies, or many of them have been removed, and India imports all its oil. And that's also a big hit on the balance of payments and so on, or used to be. I think now India is a much bigger economy, but a few decades ago, oil was a big part of balance of payments crises. So, there's a lot of reasons for India to get out from under oil. And, should the price of batteries fall and the price of renewables keep going down, I think there's a sweet spot where you start with the small vehicles, the two-wheelers, etc., and then I think passenger vehicles will follow. The problem of trucks and freight and whatever, that is a hard problem for most places. You can't even solve it in industrialized countries because you don't have the battery capacity would not work.
Milind, is there an opportunity here as renewable technology falls, battery technology, EVs, and so on, as it falls, for India to do a bit of a leapfrog over some of the fossil fuel-based technologies and expand electricity provision, expand, two-wheelers and so on to a much larger percentage of the population?
Absolutely. Absolutely, right? I mean, it's 1.34 billion people, and 80% of them are poor. I mean, I don't know what the exact data now is, but 4 or 5 years back, 80% of India's population roughly lived under $2 a day, PPP, right? Now, as all these people move up into the middle classes and so on, that's a massive market, right? And if India can take a leaf out of China's book and say, we're going to do manufacturing locally here, it's going to be hard to do because China's lead in manufacturing, especially for things like batteries and so on, is huge. But if at least we can start manufacturing, if India can start manufacturing some of these things within its own borders, as it has done with the auto sector, right? In the Indian auto sector, IC engines the IP is owned abroad, but its manufacturing is largely done in India. And so if one can imagine, then batteries, which are the key element of battery electric vehicles, are manufactured in India, then you can see that there's also a sort of market for to move up the manufacturing ladder.
Well, Milind, to sum up our conversation, what would, in your opinion, are the two biggest obstacles that India has to overcome to reach net zero by 2070?
I mean, moving the electric grid away from coal is absolutely key, right? Again, India is what, 60, 70%, something like that, coal. And, obviously natural gas is increasing, but as you know, natural gas is at best a bridge, and not, especially with the kinds of leakages you get from methane. So the biggest challenge, I think, is to move to a renewable electricity economy, right? That's on the kind of supply side, if you will. On the demand side, of course, there's a whole bunch of questions coming, with regards to transportation that we just talked about, and the health and sort of development benefits of electricity for India are clean electrification are massive. I mean, the air pollution in Delhi or much of North India, you were talking about 500 million people here, living in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, all the way from Pakistan down to Bangladesh, right? This sort of vast area is choking. And it's choking primarily because people use wood fuel for cooking, right? That's one of the primary reasons. Now, if you moved all of that to electricity and did it in a clean manner, you'd save 1.5 million lives a year, because that's what it's costing, right? So there's a whole bunch of benefits on the sort of use side, quite apart from CO2. So it makes sense for India to make this clean energy transition regardless of climate. The health costs are extraordinary, and these are health costs not just borne by poor people, which they are, of course, but also by the rich. I mean, Delhi is unlivable, and it's the capital of the country, right? So there's a whole, so that, so there are these challenges, but also these extraordinary benefits. And if the renewables can really take off, and we're seeing signs that they are, the benefits to India are extraordinary.
Milind, thank you very much for this. You provided a very interesting insights into an economy that's going to be key to the energy transition and the climate crisis. And I don't think many of us in North America understand very well at all. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Mark.